Hello, this video is number 8 and the penultimate in my current series on the history of Troy weight. It seeks to explain the relationship between the Troy pound and the more commonly used pound in the English-speaking world. That is a 16-ounce pound of about 453.6 grams. The pound variously called avoirdupois, imperial or US customary, depending upon when and where you are. The imperial or customary pound was officially fixed at 7,000 Troy grains by Elizabeth I around 1588. In this video, I will explain why I think it had to be fixed at 7,000 grains. I cannot recall anyone who has ever explained this before. Do let me know if you know of anyone who has. There are strong arguments made by both Skinner and Connor that avoirdupois is actually the Florentine standard, increasingly used in England as Edward I became reliant upon Italian banking houses for loans and for the administration of English trade itself, a sort of medieval IMF, so to speak. So the obvious next question is, where did the Florentine standard itself come from? We know that a 12-ounce pound of very close to 340 grams was in place in Florence before 1252, since the gold florins initiated in that year weighed about 3.54 grams and went 96 to that pound. Notice that, of course, this gives us a 16-ounce pound of 128 florins, that is just over 453 grams, thus avoirdupois. So the next obvious question is, where did the Florentines get their standard from? And here we should notice that by medieval times, Rome too was using that self-same pound. However, we saw in an earlier episode that after the reform of Charlemagne in 793, Rome was apparently using a straightforward Roman ounce of 8 denarii or 16 Carolinginian pennies, which gives a different 12-ounce pound of about 327 grams. Thus, sometime between 800 and 1250, Rome and Florence mysteriously changed their weight standard. We have two questions to ask about this change. Firstly, how did it change? And secondly, why did it change? The answer to the first question is staring us in the face. 327 grams is the weight of 96 denarii. 340 grams is the weight of 100 denarii. The change was something like a decimalisation. Why it changed is much more complicated. I will run through two matters which might be relevant. Firstly, the very confused ideas that arose about weight standards in the Roman period itself. Whilst both mint masters and market traders maintained a pound of about 327 grams very scrupulously over many centuries, the scribes, the ancient equivalent of professors, were busy penning a torrent of confusion. Maecenas, around 146 AD, was a philosophical Stoic at a time when Stoicism was popularly seen as the ideology of the uber-wealthy. Pretending to write about weight standards, he instead mixed chaotically together the use of the word pound, libra, in three very different contexts: metrology, monetary, and legal. Quite clearly he wished to confuse rather than enlighten his readers. Favinus, around 400 AD, alternatively set out to argue that the Roman pound was much heavier than the Attic pound. Absurd, since the clear fact is, at its root, it was very much lighter. Whilst Maecenas and Favinus seem to wish to confuse their readers, Saint Epiphanius, around 390 AD, seems better understood as being himself just confused. His translator, Dean, called him an addle-headed old pedant. That then was the situation faced by Isidore of Seville, who died in 636 AD, when he tried to bring some order to his metrological understanding. He correctly defined a Roman pound of 96 imperial denarii, thus 327 grams, but he then added a second minor, a different pound, of 100 denarii. The minor he wrote about probably did come into being around the time of Augustus, when the dram of the failing Greek states of the Eastern Empire was officially brought down to the same standard as the Roman denarius. Thus his account, that the Romans had a minor of 100 denarii, was a kind of misleading half-truth. Since we know that such as Dino Campagni in Florence was still reading Isidore even in the 13th century, it seems possible that Florence used Isidore as a pretext to launch a minor of this kind, a 340-gram 100 denarii pound. However, that seems just a way to justify the move, not a reason to motivate it. By the time Florence moved to this 16-ounce pound of about 453 grams, Islam had long used a commercial pound of about 144 bullion dirhams, that is to say 12 ounces of 12 dirhams, which comes out at about 449 grams. My guess would be that Florence, which like Venice had a huge trade with the Islamic world, contrived a 100 denarius 12-ounce pound of about 340 grams in order to mimic that Islamic commercial standard. In the last video, it was explained how, post-Charlemagne, France changed its pound to mimic English standards. In this one, it seems Italy, or at least Florence and Rome, changed their weight standard to mimic Islamic Cairo. In one case aiming slightly lower, the other case aiming slightly higher, but both probably seeking some kind of commercial advantage. Needless to say, in both cases, official scholarship tends to tell us the exact opposite of this. There is a great deal to be said about the adoption of avoirdupois in England. It is associated with the banking and commercial activities of Florentine merchants under Edward I through Edward III. In particular, it has been suggested that 80% of the silver pennies of England were exported by merchants in this period, to be replaced, if that is at all the right word, by gold florins and the like. Before the Italians came on the scene, a 16-ounce troy pound of near 500 grams was already in practice probably 16 ounces of sterlings, thus about 466 grams. Under Italian influence, it fell to notionally 453 grams, but the surviving commercial weights are even lower, at about 440 grams. All this would impact very directly indeed on the population. It governed the weight of a loaf of bread. Major changes were made to English coinage over the period 1344 to 1351, apparently in an attempt to convert all the foreign gold coins now held in England. The first attempt in 1344 introduced an English gold florin at exactly the florin standard of about 3.5 grams, alongside the traditional penny, which was still at 15/16 of a troy pennyweight. That failed, and did two more attempts. The successful reform came in 1351. In 1351, a new gold noble was struck, going 4 to the troy ounce. Meanwhile, the weight of a silver penny was reduced to 3/4 of a troy pennyweight. Essentially, the Islamic system of charging 1/16 seigniorage via the metrology itself was stopped. Weight was now fixed directly to the troy pound, with seigniorage collected just as fees. Measured in medieval wheat grains, the Troy penny had been 32 grains, the sterling penny had been 30 grains, but post 1351 it was now 24 grains. Amusing to notice that if you confuse barley with wheat grains, the new penny looks like it is full bullion weight. However, Edward III could probably see the way silver pennies were fleeing the country at an alarming rate, risking the complete collapse of peasant markets due to the lack of cash to spend at them. The alternative to inflation might well have been the road to serfdom. There are two ways of looking at the reduction of the monetary pennyweight. Clearly the penny in a man's pay packet contained a lot less silver, which would be inflationary and make him worse off. In which case, the reduction was a drastic move to preserve individual freedom in the face of currency manipulation by wealthy merchants. This is a paradox of seigniorage which is not taught in economics history classes, that it protects the currency from exportation. Notice that the Troy Standard explicitly determined coin weight in 1351. That is a couple of decades or more before the word Troy, in our current sense, was even invented. That is yet more evidence that the official 2004 account from the Museum of Scotland is nonsense. A rebellion in England in 1382, sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt, was surely in part triggered by trouble at peasant markets due to the lack of small change, and also by the reduction in the weight of a loaf of bread. Something similar was happening in Florence itself. Professional scholars like Tom Holland present as being sympathetic to the rebels, but they completely ignore these crucial financial matters. Let us now turn away from the history to the mathematics of the avoirdupois system. The calculation is straightforward, deriving from the previously described relationships. Again, I will run through it using the Troy barley grain of about 0.0648 grams. The Sumerian pound, which became the 16-ounce Troy pound, is 16 times 20 times 24 grains, as we have seen before, 7,680 grains. Since there are 128 Roman denarii in the 16-ounce Attic pound, the Roman denarius is got from the Sumerian pound by this calculation. 7,680 multiplied by 7 over 8 multiplied by 1 over 128 gives us a denarius weight of 52.5 Troy grains. In 16-ounce avoirdupois, however, there are 16 over 12 times 100 denarii. 16 over 12 times 100 times 52.5 gives us exactly 7,000 grains. That is the exact figure fixed in 1588. In 1742, the Royal Society failed to understand that and took avoirdupois as 7,004 grains empirically from a physical standard. I will let you look at what was said. Alternatively, in 1967, Skinner took avoirdupois from the Winchester standards of about 1353, and he got 6,992 grains. In 2010, John Bosack repeated Skinner's conclusion. Both of these efforts fail to understand the elegance of the medieval mathematics. Has anyone, anywhere, understood this matters since 1588? That concludes episode 8, and indeed this set of accounts of the history of Troy weight. Did anyone follow it all? Does anyone disagree? Let me know in the comments. Between the year 2000 and today, I read and corresponded with leading professional scholars worldwide on the history of weight standards. Professor Grierson's work was enormously helpful, and we met, but he died aged 95 back in 2006. I corresponded with Eric Sperber in Sweden, who died in 2014, aged 104. I could name a dozen more, but the last of those men, Harold Whittoft, died in Germany in 2023, aged 92. If there is a professional academic writing productively on this general topic today, they must keep a very low profile, as I have not noticed them. Historical metrology has dropped off the map. It has become a place the profession dare not go. Terra incognita. In episode 9, the last of this current series, I will try to explain how that happened. A couple of slides will stay on the screen for a while. Thanks for watching.